I am here with Toni Bernhard, and I am delighted, Toni, that you've agreed to participate in this interview. I've been an admirer of your work from afar. I'll give you a chance to tell a little bit of your story, but let me just say that Toni is the author of three books: How to Be Sick, a Buddhist inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers; How to Wake Up, a Buddhist inspired guide to navigating joy and sorrow; and How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness, a mindfulness guide. And so Toni was a law professor for 22 years and says gave up the classroom for the bedroom when she became ill. And I was also a professor, and when I had to go on leave because of disability, friends said, "You should write about this." And I did nothing for a year. And then I started to look around to see, okay, well, who's writing on this, and what is there to learn? And this is when you came front and center on my search, because there's a lot of good stuff by people that don't have chronic illnesses, like doctors and caregivers, but very much less out there on high quality stuff from people that are in the midst of living it. And when I saw your work and how beautifully you've done your work, it's inspired me to say, well, hey, maybe I can still write. Maybe I can still, work on this. So, Toni, I just want to say I'm deeply grateful for the journey you're on and for your willingness to share your wisdom along the way.
Thank you. Thank you for that recognition because it's not easy. I write from my bed on on days when I feel well enough and for a length of time that I feel well enough. So I feel lucky that I was even able to get the books done and then to have them received the way they've been really all over the world has made it's made all the blood, sweat, and tears worth it for me. Yeah.
Well,
And I do mean tears.
well, and this is one of the things that I find kind of contagious about your writing is it's just open and honest, and doesn't try to uh, um, you, you present yourself as a teacher, which you are, but you're not afraid to reveal the inner workings of your mind and heart, even when they don't look g- nice
Yeah.
on the outside. And that's inspiring.
Well, I was a very different kind of teacher before I got sick. I was a law professor. I wasn't the mean kind of law professor, but I will say that being sick has changed the way I relate to people and to the extent that my books are teaching the way I teach. And I saw that when I tried to continue teaching after I became ill, because I did try to continue part time for a while. And I was different in the classroom. And I think that the illness was the reason. It's as if I was feeling too sick to be fake, or not that I was particularly fake before, but I was feeling too sick to be anyone other than just who I am. There are things I know, there are things I don't know, and I was happy to admit what I didn't know. And so I think that the developing these health problems in some ways has made me more honest about my my own life and how I try to live it.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. I know bits of your story, and I know when you went back to work, that was not good for your own health. but I also heard the part where you would go and sit in the classroom, and after 22 years of loving teaching, and uh, you said you got your best course evaluations
I
in
did.
those final years,
Yeah,
and uh, which is
yeah.
just to the point that you're talking about, I think.
I think so too. I had I didn't put on airs. I was feeling I was too sick to be in the classroom. Actually, my husband, and you will know this because you've read How to Be Sick, the first book, but he was working actually in a different town in our county seat of Yolo County, which is Woodland. So it's about 20 minutes away. He would drive from work, pick me up at home, drive me to the law school, which is about 10 minutes away, drop me off, pick me up 2 hours later, drive me home, and I'd get into bed. And when I was at the law school, luckily I had a couch in my office. I would just lie on it, and then I would get up and I'd go into the classroom and sit down to
Mm-hmm.
teach. And, it was really difficult. And I think that I don't know, but I feel as if perhaps one of the reasons that I haven't recovered is that didn't, I don't really know because we're not quite sure why this virus compromised my immune system in such a way that I, I feel as if I have the flu all the time.
Yeah.
But going back to work didn't help. And the reason that I did was because I simply couldn't believe that I wasn't going to get better. I've had lots of viruses in my life.
Mm-hmm.
You're sick for a week or two and then you get better. But what I wanted to be sure to note here is that for many people, the reason they keep going to work is that they have to. If they want a roof over their heads and if they want to feed their families. And I was already at an age where I could take an early retirement. And although, we've had to tighten the budget, there's never been an issue about our losing our house or our being able to feed ourselves. And so, before I became chronically ill, I had no idea that there were so many people. Well, two things. First of all, that there were so many people forced to go to work, even though they're too sick or in pain to do so.
Yeah.
Secondly, that there are so many young people. And by young, I mean from teenagers, through your 40s, really, who suffer from chronic illness. We think of it as something that happens to old people or older people. But I hear from young people all the time in their 20s, in their 30s, even in their teens, who are suffering every day and are so worried about the future. What are they going to do? They can't go to college, they can't hold down a job. They're dependent on their parents even though they're adults. And
Yeah.
it's certainly in the United States, we don't prepare people for this possibility, either the people that it happens to or the people in their lives who have to take care of them. I don't know if Canada does a better job, but we don't do a good job in this country.
No, I think uh, I don't think we do a good job either. We know better how to relate to people when they're either healthy or very sick at the end.
Yes,
And
right.
the nature of what you're facing, and lots of people are facing, is this really long way of living that's not at the, can't be measured by the health of what you used to have.
Yes, right. Um, you know, I people will know from the subtitles of two of the books that has Buddhist inspired in it. So I have been studying Buddhism for many years. I actually practice it really as a daily practice more than it's not really a religion for me. But the Buddha just had a lot of insight and good ideas about how to live well. And what I wanted to raise that's relevant to what we've been talking about is that, he has the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth people misunderstand. They often say it means, he said, life is suffering. Well, that actually is not what it is. In the first noble truth, the Buddha set out a list of experiences that all of us will encounter during life. It's part and parcel of this precious human life. But these are not pleasant experiences. We will all grow old, and so aging is on his list, illness is on his list, death is on his list, as well as being separated from those who we love and cherish. And so there it is, right on the list, illness, as something that all of us will encounter and experience sometime during our lifetimes. And yet, as we've said, well, as you said so well, we tend to only pay attention if it's a terminal illness. But illness is just something that happens to some people. It's nobody's fault. Yeah. There's lots of different causes. It could be genetic. It could be you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just one of the conditions of being alive. And so I like being alive. And so I find it took me many years, but I've come around to saying, okay, this is one of the conditions of my life that's a real challenge and difficult, but I'm still going to try to live as full a life as I can in the house. But I still feel I live a full life. So that's what I came around to, but it took a long time.
Well, your I forget where I was going with that.
Well, I forget what you asked me last.
We've got, I was going to say Dumb and Dumber, but one of the things I've liked about your writing is outing that tendency that we speak to ourselves in a way that we would never ever speak to anyone else.
Right. Yeah.
And that's so true for me. Like, I've known that, I've had good examples of people around me on how that you need to be nice to other people. But that inner voice, that's a different issue. Well, it's not a different issue, but I seem to apply different rules to myself when I'm not being mindful.
Most of us do. What you've raised about how we speak to ourselves in a way we would never speak to someone else is actually in the chapter in the first book on compassion, specifically learning self-compassion, to treat ourselves with compassion. And, I tell actually a story that was told by one of my Buddhist teachers about how she was on her way somewhere and she was late, so she was hurrying and she was in the car and, she knocked her drink over and she said, you clumsy idiot, you knocked your drink over. And there was more, but that's a good enough example, because if I were in the car with my husband and he knocked his drink over, I would never say to him, "You clumsy idiot, you knocked your drink over." But we'll say these things to ourselves. And
Yeah.
in my view based on observation for others and hearing from other people is that this is cultural conditioning.
Mm.
And conditioning from those who raised us, who were influential in our lives. So if you had a parent who said, parents will say that to their children, "You clumsy, you knocked your milk over." And then we internalize that and think we're clumsy. And when I say cultural conditioning, I'm talking a lot about the kinds of ads on television that make us feel that, well, for example, this idea that I wasn't able to get better for the first 5 or 6 years, I blame myself for that. Well, no wonder. You turn on the TV and all you see are ads for, do these, join this gym and you'll never get sick.
Yeah.
Well, so we think that things that don't, when we're struggling, either mentally or physically, we tend to blame ourselves. And all of my books have chapters on self-compassion, because to me it's the most important thing, most important mental attitude that we can adopt in life, whether you're sick or not. And what is self-compassion? Compassion has become this word sort of like mindfulness. Everyone talks about it so much it starts to lose its meaning.
Yeah.
Compassion is nothing more than recognize or acknowledging that you're suffering and then being kind to yourself about it, instead of saying there's something wrong with me, that I'm unhappy, that whether the suffering is mental or physical. We suffer mentally every day, every time we get angry or frustrated, these are just things that happen. But so compassion simply asks you to be kind to yourself about it. And I've received thousands of, I'd like to say letters, but I have to say emails, from people who've read my books, and they say that the hardest thing for them to do is to be compassionate toward themselves, and they also say it's the one thing that that the books have helped them the most with. That's why they raise it, because I focus on it. For a good reason. I've yet to come up with a good reason not to be nice to yourself. And that's easy to say. And I'm fortunate in that once I had that realization, I no longer find it hard to be nice to myself. In other words, when I mess up, I don't turn it on myself. But I have friends and family, they're just so hard on themselves all the time. And
It's interesting. I think, Toni, you're like a canary in a gold mine. That, remember, they used to bring the birds down because the birds would show what was sick for everybody, the toxins for everyone, sooner than the workers, right? So if the birds were dying, the workers knew to leave. But I don't think we generally have that relationship of listening to those who are chronically ill as canaries of what's toxic in our society and what's compassion in our like what feeds the bad stuff and what feeds the good stuff. But I hear that in you, that those toxins, watching those images on TV, they're as bad for my twin 15-year-old daughters as they are for you.
Yes, I think uh, I think you're right that uh, again it's partly well, I said that one of the reasons that we don't incorporate this idea of illness as it's a natural part of the life cycle.
Yeah.
And I talked about conditioning, but I also think that there's fear there. And and this is why so many people who are chronically ill will lose their friends. One of the people say to me all the time, my friends went missing. Well, I'm kind of changing topics here, but I'm making the same point, which is that I had friends, a lot of my friends and colleagues went missing. And I used to be very bitter
Mm-hmm.
about that. But I've come to realize that some people, again, the culture has come up short here. If we thought of illness as a natural part of life, but we don't. And so some people, they don't want to be around people who are sick because, and not because they think you're contagious, but because it makes them realize maybe they'll get sick.
Yeah.
Or remind them of their own mortality.
Toni, your
And so,
mic, it must be covered just at the moment.
what?
Oh, there it's coming through. Your
I,
your
yeah.
voice just wasn't coming through just for a moment there. It seems to be
Okay, I don't
okay
know
now.
why.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Well, the you were talking about again mentioning society not opening, uh, not expecting to see illness, and we could go on death, and there's probably lots of normal things that society doesn't like to reflect on. But when I listen to your books, um, I'm struck how Buddhism, you didn't have to do a lot of tweaking of Buddhism to get meaningful teachings. Like Buddhism talks about impermanence. Like it's built in some of these. Yes, there will be suffering, and yes, there's some kinds of suffering that you can work to transform or even end. Right? Uh,
Just accept.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is why I was attracted to the Buddha's teachings to start with, because um, it's as if, I think this is the title of one of my chapters. He tells it like it is. And maybe that's why some people say Buddhism is pessimistic. You hear that sometimes. But to me, that's not pessimistic because I want to know what I'm in for here.
Mm-hmm.
And impermanence, the Buddha talked about three characteristics of existence that all of us will experience, and or that are just part of everyday experience. And one of them is impermanence, and what I like to call its corollaries, which is uncertainty and unpredictability. Because if everything's changing all the time, that makes life uncertain and it makes life unpredictable. And that can be really unpleasant. It can be scary.
And
And
it's a big part of being chronically ill. Like,
right.
yeah,
Yeah. I just that's my uncertainty. And
sure.
will I ever get better? I keep getting older and not getting better. And so I I like knowing what I have to work with. and that's why I appreciate that the Buddha was upfront
Yeah.
about some of these difficulties or unpleasant experiences, such as illness and aging, that because then we don't we don't feel resentful, we don't feel life is unfair. No, life is life.
Yeah.
And so I think it is a good idea to try to come to terms with the uncertainty and unpredictability of whether this has nothing to do really with being chronically ill, the uncertainty and unpredictability of life. I work on that every day because I would certainly like to feel more certain about the future and about my children's future and my grandchildren's future, all of that. But there's a wonderful Zen teaching. Zen is not my particular Buddhist tradition. There is no one Buddhism. There's all these different traditions, and Zen is one. And there's a wonderful concept in Zen called "don't know mind," and I think that shows up in all three of my books too. It must, because it's so helpful and freeing to be able to say, well, like a lot of people in the U.S. are worried about our new president as of about an hour ago.
Right.
But and don't know mine is not a substitute for activism, but being able to say, well, I really don't know how the next 4 years are going to spin out. And so to spend all my time worrying about it or whatever the things you do that not just make you unhappy, but which really handcuff you and keep you from doing things that are productive and helpful.
Yeah.
And so being able to say, to keep a don't know mind about all of life. I do that with my illness. Will I wake up well tomorrow? I don't know.
Yeah.
And that has been very freeing.
Yeah.
Because for the first 6 or 7 years, if I said, will I wake up well tomorrow? My answer would be, you better.
Yeah.
Or it's just more proof that you're weak and,
Yeah.
But to be able to say, I don't know. And for me, that's very hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because hope's a funny thing, right? Like we can hope that we will be better, and then that hope seeds all sorts of negative or feeds negative seeds in us. But the hope that comes from the ability to say, I don't know without fear, that is wonderful.
Right. There's hope that is kind of clinging, right? I hope.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, and then if it doesn't, if your hopes, it's kind of like your dreams. If your hopes don't come true, then you're miserable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like the way you put that. But it's because it is very different with keeping a don't know mind. There's another Zen teacher you may have heard of, Thich Nhat Hanh, because he seems to have a following outside of Buddhism. And he actually has a similar expression, which is, am I sure? So the next time you are absolutely certain that your friend's opinions on such and such are wrong, am I sure?
Yeah.
It allows you to there's a kind of letting go, and with that comes a freedom. And as I said, this is not a substitute if you're able. I'm not able to do activism outside the house, but this is not a substitute for trying to better the lives of people, whether there's people that you know personally, or whether it's a movement like civil rights or something like that. It's simply you're letting go. You're not letting go of your aspirations. You're letting go of attachment to the outcome. Mm-hmm. That's what you're really letting go. And why would you want to do that? It goes back to uncertainty and unpredictability, because you might as well let go of being attached to the outcome, because bottom line is you don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah.
But you have to follow your heart and work for what you think is right and will better the lives of yourself and others.
Well, I have one of the things that I like about your writing and about a lot of the Buddhist writers that I read is that you weave ideas with compassionate action and lots of very concrete, very specific. This is what how I practice loving kindness. This is how I practice joy, being joyful about other people. This is how, and some of us have heard the words that we should be joyful or peace or love, and I've just loved how Buddhism and you yourself put practices around that are accessible even to those of us that are in bed. That's a huge gift.
Thank you. Well, that, in a nutshell, you've just explained my goal in writing those books. Because, as I said a bit earlier, words like compassion, mindfulness, they just float around all the time. And people say, well, okay, but what does it really mean? You know? And so what I've done in the books is to offer people practices, and also related to impermanence, very specific practices to help them I've never used this phrase before, but, live the truth of those ideas. So, because like I said, it's easy to say, be self-compassionate. Well, how? And so I have a lot of ideas. As a matter of fact, I'm working on my publisher asked me to do a revised and expanded edition of that first book. And I'm really enjoying it. It's so hard to come up with the initial thing you're going to put with the original piece of writing, but to go back at what you've already written.
Yeah.
And make it better, get rid of stuff that doesn't apply anymore, and I've been adding new practices, and so I'm very practice oriented, because that's the only way to change. The Buddha said something wonderful. He said the mind, and this is what neuroscientists are saying today, the mind is flexible. The Buddha said it's flexible like the balsam tree. And so we can change. And that's when I talk about conditioning, we can change that conditioning. Mm-hmm. It's and so this is so hopeful, really, that if someone is watching this and says, well, I'm just always going to be an angry person, I would say that you don't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And one thing that tells you that is this universal law of impermanence, which actually is not original to Buddhism. All of the Eastern Hinduism, all of the Eastern, and I don't know as much about religions, I have to admit. I was raised in a Jewish household, but my parents weren't religious, so
Hmm.
um, I don't know a lot about Western religions. But uh, the impermanence is considered a universal law in science and in religion.
Yeah.
Well, that tells you right there. If change is the law, is part of the human condition, the law of the universe, then we can change. And there's no reason to identify with some of your what you think of as immutable characteristics, like angry
Yeah.
and frustrated and short tempered. You can change.
Yeah.
And so that's really my goal in the book, is to offer practices to help people change. They've helped me. It helps me to write the books.
Well, and that's there's a lot of things that get fuzzy when you have chronic illness, but there's also some things that become more clear, and you don't have time to fiddle around with those things that don't give life. And
Right.
you have practiced now in bed for 15 years, uh, and one could see that as depressing. Um, but if you give up the idea of having a cure is normal, and or all of the ideas that come with that, that a heart can stay open, um, uh, to be compassionate even in the situations that you're facing, that's that's an amazing story of resilience. That's inspiring.
Yeah. I still get sad when I have to miss something I'd really like to
Yeah.
be a part of. But sad is okay. Sad is sad is very human.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only if you fall into a state of permanent sadness, then we're sort of getting into the territory of clinical depression, and you probably should be seeking help for that in some way or another.
Yeah.
But sadness over something that you've missed, or something that I get sad, but I say, but I don't. First of all, I don't. I as when I get sad, I've learned to go to use some self compassion practice, and that really helps me. One of the
Yeah.
things that I suggest people do is craft phrases that are kind to yourself, that speak directly to the difficulties. So I might say, it's so hard to miss my granddaughter's birthday party, and just say, so it's okay to be sad about it.
Yeah.
But when you then direct compassion toward yourself over that sadness, it softens it, it helps you accept it, and then you move on. So,
Well, practices on self-compassion is probably the best place to we can end this interview, Toni. I know we're past our time, and I know your body will remind you after this of the
feel it.
cost of this. So I do want to end, but I'm so glad you agreed to do this. I'm glad that you are writing. I know it comes at no small cost to you, but thank you so much for sharing your teaching and your wisdom and your life.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.